Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss Trump's 28-point peace plan for Ukraine and the summit between Donald Trump and Zohran Mamdani. I'm joined by Ashley Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So, over the weekend, big controversy broke out over Trump's peace plan. Different of allegations flew around, some claiming that it had been effectively drafted by the Russians, including senators who had been briefed by Secretary of State Marco Rubio on the plan. Rubio then called the senators back and said, "You must have misunderstood me. It was not drafted by the Russians." European leaders and Ukrainians are quite unhappy with the initial proposal. They've watered it down some after meetings with Rubio and Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner in Geneva. So the draft no longer states that Ukraine will be barred from joining NATO or the EU. It no longer imposes such strict limits on Ukrainian troop levels, and it no longer concedes as much to Russia territorially, all of which, of course, is likely to make Putin less receptive to the agreement. I mean, it's fair to say this has been a kind of complex process, right? You have four parties. You have the United States, Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. Ashley, what's your sense of this kind of strange negotiation between all these groups? Is there actually a possibility of reaching a peace deal, or are things just going to stall out?
It's really difficult to say because European leaders seem desperate to exert control over the situation, desperate to fight to the last Ukrainian. I'm not even sure if Ukrainians themselves have the same resolve as European leaders do. And it's listening to the news in Europe the last couple of days, I really did start to get the idea. I started to question some of what I have believed for the last few years. And I just thought, yeah, if you give away too much, if you essentially bar Ukraine from any kind of resources for self-preservation for the future, what is to stop Putin from moving forward? I mean, there obviously lots of people say, "Oh, well, Russia has very clear territorial desires, very clear claims. It has fought extremely hard for very small gains and has had enormous losses. There's not really any reason for Putin to carry on as he has." But I have heard that many times before. I heard that before the invasion. No. There's, there aren't sufficient reasons for Putin to carry on. And I don't know, every single time he seems to display a resolve to carry on. So I actually started to get really, really worried about this peace plan. And I started to think, the only person who seems to really, truly have not got the memo that war is good for business is, ironically, Donald Trump. He seems to be the only one in all of these negotiations who seems really and wholeheartedly to want peace at all costs and to do business by other means. Nobody else, including Europe, seems to want that. So I think deleting these kinds of clauses from the initial 28-point draft, you're putting in all this stuff about making it so that Ukraine can't join NATO. It's also a provocation, and I don't know, I feel like it's an enormous kind of stalemate, and it's very, very difficult to get a sense of what anybody wants. And the only thing that just keeps moving around in the back of my mind is that EU interests are to exert control over the situation, to have their hands in this, and that war is good for business. And I don't think anybody says that out loud, but I think that's always in the background, particularly as we are perpetually teetering on the edge of crisis. And the UK, in joining the efforts, has has outright stated, this will be good for business. This is gonna, we're gonna get stuck into that Ukraine war, and it's gonna bring jobs to the UK. So I don't know. I feel like the only people who don't want to be in this anymore are Donald Trump and the Ukrainians. So it's very, very difficult to see where this is going to go. I don't think that this is a realistic plan for a long-lasting peace, mainly because of Europe and Putin, who seem dead set on dragging each other into war, but they are also having to play this really difficult long game because of, the obvious thing we all learn in high school, mutually assured destruction. You can't go directly to war with each other. So they have to they seem comfortable in these kinds of proxy wars, comfortable in this kind of these sort of incremental encroachments on territory. So I don't know. It's difficult to see how this is going to play out. Geoff, do you have a sense of whether or not this is going to work?
Not really. I was sort of interested in this point about a sort of military neo-Keynesianism, that, part of what's going on here is that there's sort of and as you said, I think we published something about this some months ago by Ted Reese that was kind of about these bizarre statements by Keir Starmer that sort of, this is going to be fantastic for the British economy. And so, it does seem that this is part of the logic here. And I wonder to what extent it's, without having any expertise, is also kind of part of the logic on the Russian side, that in a way, this war has actually been quite good for the Russian economy, contrary to what was assumed. It's and it's also kind of allowed for a greater autonomy. The various sanctions and so on that were placed on Russia have allowed it to, kind of gain greater autonomy and independence. And obviously, it's also at this point still kind of ahead of the West in terms of, basic kind of defense industrial base, sort of munitions manufacturing and so on. So, yeah, I'm not sure. I guess the question is, I think Trump has a kind of interest in ending or in forging peace, simply because if he can sort of own that, I think that's an idea that's appealing. He obviously finds the image of the peacemaker an appealing one, and one that he wants to take on. But I'm not sure beyond that who really has a strong incentive for peace. So to that extent, I agree with Ashley's assessment that, on some level, the interests at work here might actually, on balance, encourage the continuation of war, which is a disturbing situation, but not one that's unfamiliar from prior history.
I should add, I did say that war is good for business, but if somebody wants to, so I can just imagine somebody like, what? It is good for some business and or good for on the whole, but it's catastrophically bad. When I say good, I mean economically in the long run, because of creative destruction. I mean, we obviously would not want this as humans, but it's catastrophically bad for some businesses. It's the destruction of old means of production and all that kind of thing that makes way for new rounds of investment. That's what I mean. Obviously, it's extraordinarily bad if you're the one getting destroyed. Just to clarify,
there's just a lot of confusion here, I think, about the way that the American kind of informal empire is supposed to work. I mean, we have international partners, and they're upholding a rules-based international order. And so there's a sense, just in the kind of framing and self-justification of these institutions, that they don't exist purely to serve American interests. They aren't structured explicitly around deference to an imperial center. That's not the stated purpose. And I think that's one element feeding into this because Europe benefits from the American security umbrella and security guarantees, and Europe really wants those to be extended to Ukraine, as do many members of the American elite. But I think my own question is just, all right, if America is backstopping all this, if we're really the ones underwriting the entire project, shouldn't we have the kind of the first and the final say in how things are determined? And a lot of policymakers seem to think that we shouldn't. That really we have these security commitments, we have these projects we need to uphold. Donald Trump, who has long expressed skepticism of the way NATO is structured and conducted, who's long doubted that it really works in American interests, is elected while presenting himself as the peace candidate and campaigning for peace. But from both Republicans and Democrats, there's a sense that there really shouldn't be a change in policy despite that change in democratically elected leadership. And I think that's the kind of troubling part. I mean, the kind of specifics of the proposal are worth debating and are going to be subject to revision in various ways, even if it concludes successfully. But finally, the American people should have a say on whether and how this is all conducted. If America is indeed a democratic republic and not just an empire.
Well, in some sense, this, is a continuation of just a long-standing pattern of American foreign policy and its relationship to American democracy. If we just go back to Eisenhower's warnings about the military-industrial complex, essentially he was warning that there was this entity that was gaining power that would make it unaccountable via democratic means, and thus eroding the basis of democracy. And we've seen over and over again presidents coming into power in opposition to a war that is underway at the time, but then actually struggling mightily to bring about their aims on which they were partly elected of bringing a resolution to the war. And part of this seems to have to do with, part of it is, as you said, Matthew, has to do with the kind of complicated entanglement in the international system of alliances, but it also has to do with, again, the various interests at work here that don't really stand to benefit from a drawing down or de-escalation. And so to that extent, I think, we're just in the latest phase. We saw this with, obviously, as somebody who's sort of on the anti-war left in the 2000s, I will say, we saw this very clearly with Obama, that he came into power as supposedly a peace candidate. And then, whether obviously to some extent through his own failings and dishonesty, but also because of the immense power exerted by the sort of, broader foreign policy and extremely complex and heterogeneous foreign policy apparatus, he was not able to follow through on much of what he promised and was elected to do. So in a sense, the question is whether Trump, with his norm breaking and lack of concern with offending people or breaking with precedents and so on, is in a better position to really rein in these various interests that don't really see any upside to the de-escalation of hostilities in these contexts.
It's also a bit of an irony that it was candidates on the right, or the ostensible right, across Europe that were the anti-war. They were the only ones who were promising an anti-war platform, whereas it was mainly the kind of bureaucratic center, so-called left, in governments that were, in favor of continuing war, trying desperately to turn it in, at the very beginning at least, turned it into some kind of war about democracy, 5 minutes after they had said democracy was actually a negative thing during COVID and so on. So it's interesting to see this kind of reversal, where and I fully expected as well that Trump would not hold the line either. As you said, being elected on a platform is different than actually executing it. And to see that seems to have been instrumental in going behind the backs of European leaders in order to get this done is something to behold. But again, it's just, I don't know, the powers behind it, the desires behind it are so great. I don't see it happening. I don't see any kind of resolution.
Is Donald Trump a fascist? Zohran Mamdani has said yes. Tried to dodge the question when asked in the Oval Office, and Trump told him, "Go ahead, just go ahead. Say yes. It's easier that way." Quite a moment from the Trump Mamdani summit. I mean, to me, it seemed like the kind of perfect culmination of years of rhetoric we've got from the kind of smart progressive left, which has, I think, tried to distinguish itself not very successfully from the more centrist left by adopting a harsher rhetoric toward Trump and calling him a fascist. It kind of underlines self-conception that these people like to have, that they are anti-fascists. The same rhetoric has spread widely. This is also how the kind of former conservatives at the Bulwark see themselves, and lots of MSNBC hosts. But these people who talk about Trump's fascism, who compare him to Hitler, they haven't actually engaged in acts of violent political resistance that they celebrate in recalling anti-fascist efforts in the past. And I think it just raises the question: do they really mean it? And Trump seems to think that they don't. They don't quite mean it. He calls Democrats, Trump in the campaign, many times called Democrats, the fascists, the fascist, communist, socialist. He threw these terms around himself, and I think his response to Zohran indicates that he just always viewed this as political hyperbole, and he's happy to have indulged it. He's very unapologetic about indulging in it himself, and he's happy to grant permission slip to Democrats or democratic socialists he likes who do the same thing.
Well, the parallel moment was when it was brought up that Representative Elise Stefanik, who is likely to run for governor, or maybe has announced to run for governor, has been calling Mamdani a jihadist. And I believe Trump was asked whether he agreed with that characterization. He said no, but it's a campaign, so it's the kind of thing she's going to say. She's a fierce campaigner or whatever. So yeah, it's pretty much this recognition that there are these sort of rhetorical deployments that are going to be used in the rough and tumble of campaigns. And that it was a very interesting moment. I do think that, it was quite a remarkable encounter. I've argued, and I think it was sort of in a way a coming full circle, because I still think the most significant thing about Mamdani is that he began his campaign by talking to people in his district who voted for Trump. And, to me, that was a very significant move coming from a DSA leftist who, was kind of in the early 2020s, engaged in all the standard sort of abolish the police type rhetoric, which is that he, began his campaign by acknowledging there were legitimate grievances that led people to vote for Trump in 2024. And that, any serious politician on the left should be able to speak directly to those grievances and try to, openly court and win those voters. So, to me, that that was sort of the underrated, significant starting point of Mamdani's campaign. And so I think his willingness to go to the Oval Office and be, part of this strange spectacle, is partly just it shows his willingness to continue to, try to speak to voters who might also vote for Trump. So that just, it's a very simple point, but it's something that I think for much of the DSA left and of course the kind of Democratic center, sort of Clintonian center was sort of considered beyond the pale for a long time. So which partly just speaks to, I would say, a fundamental unseriousness about political contestation and democracy, which went along with, what was the real significance of the fascist moniker. Not so much, taking to the hills and starting a guerrilla movement, but rather trying to use the courts and other institutions to block Trump from, executing his agenda when he was first in office, or from coming back to power in 2024. So really, the practical correlate of the sort of fascism rhetoric was simply a lot of lawfare and sort of attempts to evade democratic contestation. So, it seems to me that's kind of what the Democrats have been up to, and what, when they were calling him a fascist, what they really meant was, we don't want to have to actually compete in elections with you. And we don't see you as somebody who can legitimately participate in the electoral process. And so we're going to use all these other means to try to block that. So the basic difference in terms of how Mamdani is presenting himself as a candidate is that he's not seemingly, even if he's using the fascist moniker himself, sometimes he's not seemingly of a piece with this broader strategy of simply trying to, delegitimize Trump out the gate as a political actor or participant in the democratic process. So, that's fundamentally why this seemed like a significant meeting. We could also talk about, Leila Mishui wrote several weeks ago about the kind of common impulses behind Trumpism and Mamdani's proposals, which, as she argued, sort of have to do with the basic political fact of public debt and the need to kind of centralize political power and the power of the executive in order to govern under those conditions. So people can check that out. I think it's called Trump and Mamdani Have More in Common Than You Think. And we could also talk about my favorite, sort of historical phenomenon to rattle on about, which is Argentinian Peronism, which really is this kind of unique right-left crossover sort of horseshoe movement that, I think we can clearly see the way that it fuses many of the tendencies at work within Trumpism with many of the things that appeal to the sort of DSA left. It's essentially a kind of, it's a social welfarist movement that is galvanized by, extreme populist rhetoric and a kind of cult of personality. And those things, we could go into various sort of policy aspects of this, but if you were to create a kind of composite political program of the DSA and MAGA, it would essentially look something like Argentinian Peronism, pretty straightforwardly. And this is why you had kind of figures who were associated with essentially the kind of fascist or fascist sympathizing right in Argentina, as well as figures of the kind of Marxist far left who ended up kind of being absorbed into this big tent of Peronism, which, essentially became this kind of undefeatable electoral juggernaut for a long time, which, like Trump, but in a way to a greater extent, sort of had to be kept out of power by other means, including military coups and so on, because of the immense fear of the traditional elite of this, extremely potent political movement. And then, the irony, of course, today is that the Argentine president is a radical libertarian sort of free marketeer who thinks of the Peronist elite as the elite that needs to be displaced and as the kind of object of populist vituperation. So, sort of the tables have turned in that way, but it's very clear if you look at the history of Peronism and its policy, it's highly protectionist, kind of industrial policy, import substitution oriented political economy. It's kind of nationalization of industries. There's a great deal, again, that it has in common with Trumpism, as well as again, this kind of welfarist, I'd say, kind of managed kind of labor union regime that it might have in common with DSA activists, although not the sort of queer, polyamorous whatever type, because it was quite quite sort of socially traditionalist and so on. But in any case, we could see in this summit, I would say, the glimmerings of a possible American Peronist synthesis, which I doubt will come about, but it was at least interesting to get a glimpse of it when Trump said something like, he was surprised by how much they agreed on policy and so on.
Yeah, I mean, what you were saying about Mamdani appears to know that there's an opportunity to speak to Trump supporters by having a conversation with Trump. That shows a rare political and deeper sort of political understanding and honesty that, I mean, for a long time, anybody who has been leftish has been more afraid about who they stood next to and who they were photographed next to and who they were seen sort of shaking hands with than they seemed to want to actually do anything. And it was, you had the politics of essentially social climbing and resume building that was just so obnoxious to see. And so to see them sort of smiling and shaking hands, however much through gritted teeth or with however much tension, I thought was quite interesting and spoke to a desire at least to be a kind of statesman that is able to forge awkward connections in order to get things done. And it made me realize that all of these kinds of comparisons, so this person's a fascist and this person's Hitler, and you're like, look at the people that they're talking about. And you're like, why? What are you even on about? And it's just sort of anybody who vaguely resembled a statesman, smacked too much of the 20th century, was, it was like anybody who had like an ideology or politics, that was like really scary. And if you were like a good speaker, not like Obama was like quote unquote good speaker, but it was quite vacuous. It was that kind of like PR kind of good speaker, like nothing's actually said, but you actually like sort of aroused emotions in people. It's like, oh my gosh, that's fascism. Because what happened was, it was because of this fear of the 20th century, the fear of ideology, the end of ideology, the fear of fascism, led to this kind of evacuation of politics and its uptake by people who are essentially, pencil pushers, bureaucrats, people who they're safe because they don't believe in anything. And they're like, we have this new idea. We're going to turn all of politics into administration. It's just administration. It's just, there shouldn't be any heart in this. There shouldn't be any ideology, any faith, any belief. That's dangerous. That's fascism. We saw what happened, or it's communism. We saw that in the 20th century. And so then everybody except a bland PR-led bureaucrat became a fascist. And I feel like we're still kind of in that zone. And it's reflected even in the epithets that Trump and Mamdani throw around, because they recognize in each other somebody with conviction. And that still is tainted, I think. But I mean, obviously, there were some very bland and basic reasons why they need to play nice with each other. I mean, Trump has personal interest in making, not having the, anybody in power in New York be against him. He just has personal kind of financial interest. He needs to continue being able to work, to do business. And Mamdani obviously needs the government not to be against him to get anything done. So there's just sort of like a basic reason why you need to forge these alliances. But it's a good thing that people were willing to kind of be photographed next to each other, being cordial, after so many years of this nonsense of like no platforming and all this junk. And also what they were coming together over, what they seem to have common ground over, is obviously affordability. And, no matter how much those in power have tried to fudge the numbers, it's becoming clearer and clearer on the ground that something is not right, and that politicians have to be able to deal with it, and perhaps forge alliances in order to do so. I don't know, but I found it, obviously, I mean, it's an obvious thing to say, but I found it extraordinarily refreshing, and it's made me kind of have this respect for Mamdani's acumen in realizing that if you actually speak to the other side, you have an opportunity to show them that you're not a lunatic in the way that they paint you to be. And that's always been Trump's, well, I don't think he cares about being seen as a lunatic, but Trump doesn't care who he speaks to. He doesn't, well, I don't know, except for the fake news and all that sort of thing. But he doesn't really care what he says, and that's also extremely refreshing. So I don't know, maybe we are saying goodbye to that boring era. Perhaps we are ready to embrace an era of statesmanship. Maybe these people are poor placeholders, but maybe the next generation will be better. I don't know, but I'd like to see that happen.
I think this is maybe a place where you can point to, Mamdani's immigrant identity and his support from an immigrant community as an important factor. Guys who, run bodegas or own bodegas in New York probably have some kind of admiration for the pluck and enterprise of Mamdani, but also the success of a Trump. So I think that this is an advantage he has that maybe some of his fellow Bowdoin grads just lack. So anyway, some people were disturbed and alarmed by the meeting, but probably a healthy sign for our politics. And for more, go to compactmag.com/subscribe.